round of reviews. That's 11 and 12. So Alana is going to do a great job facilitating us through those two sections today. And we're very fortunate today to have a special guest. Our executive director is on, so he may want to encourage us along as well today.
All right, I'm going to go back into stealth mode. See you later.
All right. Ben?
Sure, David. Thanks a lot. I don't want to add too much more other than to note that we are recognizing that we have a bit of a backlog in terms of developing or refining these regulations to reflect the evolution of health information exchange in the state, which is really a reflection of what's happening nationally. So I've asked David to shift from second gear to third gear as we move forward with these. We think this is an important foundation for really enabling the important work that health information exchanges in Maryland in general, and the work that CRISP has done in particular over the last several years. And this is an important foundation for that work. So please take it away. Thank you all for giving us 2.5 hours of your time today.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So Alana, I will yield to you.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks. And Dr. Suarez, I see your note. We do have 2 hours calendared for this afternoon, although I'll say, I think to David's point, there is the potential that we may not need all of that time. So we'll see how it goes. We've said that before, and then you all come through with really profound comments and input. So that doesn't always quite work out as we anticipate sometimes, but we'll see. So, so yes, sorry, Dr. Suarez, let me, so the timeline to complete the entire review of the rules. So there are just 2 sections left in the regulations that we expect to get through this afternoon. So that should wrap up at least this phase of the review for these regulations. So before we go any further, I should just quickly mention that we are recording as usual for this meeting, and a few logistics things before we get started. As usual, again, if you have any difficulty either hearing us or participating in any way, please feel free to reach out to me. We'll try to get you the technical assistance you need to troubleshoot any issues that may come up. And if you are joining us by phone, please announce yourself when speaking. We ask that anyone joining us either on the phone or on screen that you mute yourselves when you're not speaking. If we do get any significant amount of background noise, we may mute you, but you can always unmute your line yourself to speak. And we do ask that you use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and that just helps us kind of facilitate the conversation as we go along. So with those points out of the way, I will just give a quick overview of the progress that we've made since our last meeting in March, or during the last meeting, I should say, when we reviewed draft proposed changes to the regulations in sections 8, 9, and 10. So those are the notice of breach and non-HIPAA violation, the registration and enforcement section, and then the requirements for accessing, using, or disclosing of data through an HIE for secondary use. So today, what we will do is pick it up in section 11. And again, we do hope to get through all of the proposed changes to section 11 and 12 this afternoon. And Kelly, I will ask you to go ahead and pull up the regulations document, if you would, please.
And Alana, while you and Kelly are pulling that up and sort of putting it to section 11, let me just remind the group, first and foremost, thank you all for your time, commitment, your help today. The timeline we're going to be following here is once we get through the changes today, staff will do another review. We will work with Post and Shell Steve Fox and Cindy and his team, and Cindy and others there to incorporate the changes, review the changes, make sure that they make sense, they fit, they're appropriate. And then after that, we will then work with our internal counsel, Alexa Bertinelli. She's on, you all can see her. She's fairly new to us here. We're very fortunate to have her, and we will get her input on some of the changes that we've proposed. And then, of course, there are multiple opportunities for input through the informal comment process as well as the formal publication of the regulations. So as you all may have recalled from prior experiences having worked through this process, there are what we call many bites at the apple opportunities. So please don't feel that if your comment isn't included today or hasn't been included, that there isn't any opportunity for that to occur. So with that, let's proceed into section 11 of the regulation. Lana, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, David. And so as we go into this, again, I'll just quickly give a quick overview of the process. So Kelly has the regulations pulled up on screen. You'll see there some track changes in blue. Those are recommended proposed changes by Post and Shell. You'll see a second color, which I don't see on screen now, but there will be a second color that will show up when we get to another section. And those are any, so MHCC, anything, I think it appears in red. So any comments from MHCC that we've received from the HIE policy board along the way, specific members will show up in red. So those are the two colors that you'll see. And so I think with that, we can go ahead and get started with section 11. And I am aligning myself. So section 11 talks about requirements for accessing, using, or disclosing data through an HIE in an emergency. And there are just a few proposed changes in this section. The first is referencing, so in this first, in A, an HIE shall develop and implement emergency access policies and procedures that satisfy the following requirements. So in A1 there is a change that adds a requirement to comply with section 3B, which requires the HIE to provide consumers with information about the HIE. So whereas we originally had language and still have language for section 3B1 that specifically requires the consumer education plan, we've now added language to comply overall with or align with section 3B. So I will pause to see if anyone has thoughts there. Okay. Then hearing none, we can scroll down to the next edit, which is specifically just a minor wording change to B1D. So we've added the word applicable. So instead of just saying the participating organization has an established policy, we say the applicable participating organization. And I'll pause there for just a moment.
So I'm curious about applicable for just a moment. This, and I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts here, but if they're a participating organization, why applicable seems like in some cases they may not be required, in other cases they would be required. I'm curious to get thoughts about that, just to make sure we're all aligned. Catherine, any suggestions?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, can you hear me, David?
Yes, good afternoon.
That's item D. I almost want to see what's above that, if there's something in the top line that drove us to choose the word applicable there. So scroll
Yeah.
up.
So Kelly, can you go up a little? There we go.
Clearly communicate the following: A, B, C.
And you can go down a little, Kelly.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's necessary.
Yeah. Is there other thoughts, Pamela? Your thoughts? Oh, Dr. Suarez, will come to you in just a sec.
Yeah, I don't think it matters. I think the idea would be that not all participating organizations may take advantage of the emergency use. And so the idea might be that not all participating organizations have to have a policy that describes these requirements. It's only those that would take advantage of the emergency use. That might be the reason. That's the only reason I can think of, but I don't know if it's necessary. I think there's always an assumption that it's applicable only to those that are applicable.
And that's a good point, Pamela. We'll make a note and maybe we'll get Steve to look at that for us. Dr. Suarez, your comments?
Yeah, my sense there might be a reason for this word there, and that is because the data that is about to be accessed through the emergency process is about or is held or is provided or was provided by a specific participating organization. And in that sense, the way I would understand it is the applicable participant organization means the organization that originally provided that data, which is about to be accessed through the emergency procedure. That is the only reason I would think there was a.
It's a good point too.
But outside of that, it is because otherwise it said the participating organization has an established, which is that participating organization, which of all the participating organizations. And there is a reference under 2 above, attest that all conditions of the participating organization's policy have been met. So which is that participating organization in this particular case? So that is a question, I guess, and it might mean that there is a need to put applicable not only here in D, but also up in 2, Roman numeral number 2.
Okay, Kelly, if you could capture that, and Alana, back to you.
And yep, and I see Adrian has her hand raised.
Okay.
Adrian Ellis.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Pamela. I think the only reason you would need it is because not all participating organizations can use the emergency access provisions, right? So like think payers or others probably wouldn't be trying to take advantage of emergency access, but I agree. I'm not sure it's necessary, but I think that's the situation where they're referencing here is not everyone's going to have an emergency policy because they're not going to try to get access in an emergency.
Good point.
And it might be worth pointing to, if we're going to have applicable here, it should also go up in number 2, Roman numeral number 2.
Yeah, I think Kelly put that in. I'm looking. Okay, good feedback.
All right, then traveling on the actual final proposed change to section 11. Kimberly, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was actually, before you moved down the page, I was going to go back up the page and just, so I didn't, the provision about abiding by the requirements of regulation 0.03b, just sort of that generally concerns me without, because it suggests that they need only meet the requirements of 03b, when in fact they may need also meet the many other requirements laid out in these regulations. And without going through them all, I wouldn't want it to be considered an exclusionary statement.
Fair enough, right. Let's add a comment there, Kelly. And Pamela.
I'm going to embarrass myself here, but I think I'm struggling with truly understanding the emergency situation. I'm just trying to figure out when this happens? Are we saying, because I'm looking at this and it says you have to have policies that talk about when you would do it. Are we talking about situations where a patient has opted out and we're asking to use it in an emergency? I can't remember the context for the use here.
So it goes back a long way. It goes back to that whole notion of break the glass. If a patient shows up in an emergency room, you know, and the issue of liability was brought into these discussions a decade ago, and the group thought that you ought to have a break the glass approach. And if you opt out, most HIEs don't maintain the data. In fact, I believe Chris and maybe Craig could talk to that. If they don't even maintain the data, where historically in the early days, HIEs were holding on to data and just sort of partitioning it. And now if you opt out, they don't even retain that data. And Craig, you can keep me honest if I've got that wrong.
No, you're right. We will delete data for patients who have opted out, except obviously demographics to maintain the opt-out status.
Yeah, so it is more of a patient arrives in a situation that's, it could be trauma or emergency, and it gives the provider the chance, or it gives a treating provider or someone in a critical situation. It may not be always the ED, but it allows for that concept to break the glass. Does that help? I want to make sure I answer your question.
I guess I'm struggling with what the glass is on. You know, I mean, I think that's what, so, you know, the idea being that so is it that scenario where if the HIE happens to hold on to the data, even if a patient opts out, this in an emergency, they can get access to it? I mean, it almost feels like I'm just wondering if it's still necessary today and whether this is worth revisiting as a whole section. Just trying to understand the actual context in which it would be used. And I'm sure there is one. I'm just failing to understand.
Yeah, because there is the notion of assent. Even if you're in the providers are supposed to be able to say, hey, look, I want to check your records. I see that there's more information out there, that in the encounter, the providers are supposed to be able to say, I'm going to check your records. And if the patient were to say no, then the providers aren't supposed to be checking the records. The notion here is it's more or less, if the data is available and the patient can't assent to having their information viewed, then the provider can use their judgment. And HIEs in the early days, they maintain this data, and now they don't. So that's the purpose of having an emergency capability, if you will.
Yep, go ahead,
I
Dr.
have yeah, just on this one. Yeah, I mean, this is clearly the point is only certain people will be able to access the data. Otherwise, without the emergency procedures, it gives the impression that anyone can access the data. So the HIE allows access to the data to certain people, and then there are going to be circumstances in which other people are going to be in a situation where they need to break the glass. That's, I think, the point that this section is making. Right. Without that break the glass option, then it's either only the people that are authorized to access the data through the HIE has the ability, and no other, never ever, or there would be everybody accessing the data. So there is that difference. Some people have access to the data, some don't, and those that don't will be able to break the glass in some circumstances through this emergency procedure. That's the way I understand it.
So, so I think we go back to the original question, I think, that came from Kimberly. So, Kimberly, did we get to your point or provide enough background that allows you to have context to what's here?
That question was raised by Pamela. So, and I went and, because the question was a good one, and I went and I pulled my folder from when we did these emergency access regs, and because I still love paper, And our goal and scope, so the stated purpose then was, much like David said, that informed consent cannot be obtained for specific emergency medical encounters. Information available to the participating organizations through the HIE may be important in providing appropriate medical care. The policy applies unless a consumer has specifically precluded the sharing of information in emergency situations. So it was supposed to be able to allow access when, in the professional opinion of the healthcare provider, they're clear and a significant risk of death or imminent serious injury exists, and the consumer's condition precludes the ability for participating organization to obtain the consumer's consent, which then prompted me to go back and look at our definition of emergency, which is where I was going when you asked me my question, David. So,
Well, I'm just impressed that you could put your finger on a file from that long ago.
yeah, me too. Look at my office. I don't know.
And by the way, I'm equally as impressed with my memory to recall that long ago. Okay, Alana.
All right, great. So then taking us down to, we have an addition at the bottom of section 12. We've added in C, if you scroll up a little bit, Kelly, to the bottom of the previous page, we've added a requirement for HIE policies and procedures specific to emergency access. So the addition is in C there. Yes, Dr. Suarez.
Yeah, I wonder about this section because two reasons. One is this is supposed to be break the glass to data that is held by the HIE, and aligning the participant organization established policies and procedure with those that the HIE has might not be realistic because organizations might have break the glass policies that are different and more stringent or more lenient, however you want to think of it, and might not be possible to be completely aligned with the HIE. So there's 2 points here. One is this section applicable to the HIE or both the HIE and the participating organization, as in break the glass for both HIE data as well as participant organization data? That's question number one. And question number two is this concern about alignment.
Okay, those are good points. So we want to take those back and do a little digging on. You raise a good point about there could be variation. So it could just be language, but maybe Pamela can help untangle that for us.
Well, I wanted to scroll back up for a second because I thought there was already a requirement that we in the applicable, when we talked about the applicable language here, the applicable participation right there has an established policy that describes the requirement and attestation process for emergency access. So it seems like we already have that requirement in there. So I'm not sure the purpose of C. And it just feels like I agree with Dr. Suarez that it feels a little overly prescriptive and might be duplicative.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kelly, you're capturing that. And Adrian may have a recall that's equally as
I'm just going to agree. I'm just going to agree with Pamela and Dr. Suarez, and noting that, MHCC doesn't really regulate the participating organizations, that would have to come through the HIE. And so we would have to try to find a way to ensure that, this prescription was being followed, right? So I think for those organizations that want to use the emergency process, that's one thing, but requiring that all of them establish policies and procedures for this access, it seems a little much.
Okay, got it. Alana.
All right, great. Then we can travel on to section 12. And the first kind of grouping of edits we have here in A actually align quite a bit with edits throughout the section, but I'll pause. Pamela, please go ahead.
So this just goes to the sort of comments I've made throughout, which is I'm not sure why we're adding a regulatory requirement on participating organizations here. This is a regulation to regulate HIEs. And so if HIEs have an obligation to give access to consumers, that makes sense, but I'm not sure that this is the right place to require that.
Yeah, I think that's what we've heard, and Adrian will probably make a similar comment that the regulations aren't regulating participating organizations. Adrian, is that similar?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I don't see how Chris could possibly tell Hopkins what they should or should not do in their My Charts application for patients, right? So I think that would be really hard for the HIE to try to enforce.
And Dr. Suarez has his hand raised as well.
Yes, yeah, very quickly, just to do a very strong second on all the points that Pamela have raised and others. I think, in fact, I think this is one of those overarching considerations that the regulations, wherever they reference participating organizations, are not imposing onto participating organization certain additional requirements. But specifically to this point, we are already required by federal law, by CMS, by ONC, through information blocking, and by many others, to provide consumer access to their health information via electronic means. So the last thing we want to do is go even farther and prescribe more things at the state level that might not even be consistent with all the other requirements in information blocking, in CMS, interoperability requirements, and other things. So I really think this is not applicable here.
Okay, Catherine.
Thanks, Alana. I absolutely agree with these comments, but it makes me wonder, since we've got a crack team of attorneys adding so many comments here of this kind of theme, it makes me wonder if, given the time that has elapsed now, if there is some precedent of participating organization like policy that does not align well with HIE. And while this is not the appropriate place to create some participating organization requirement to make them align, I'm just wondering if there's some highlighted issue that needs to be addressed somewhere else. So more of a question for David and team than a response here. But I'm just noting that common theme.
Yeah, I think that's one we take away. There's also, I think Leah brings up a really good point, Leah, on her comment in the comment box, and that we want to make sure that in this next pass, when we work with Post and Shell, that the software developers who are considered HIEs by law, that the requirements are either don't apply and they're noted somehow in the regulations, or the regulations are customized enough that they are applicable. There are probably some areas where it's clear that they are applicable, and other cases where it could be questionable. So that's part of our next go through to make sure that it applies both to the traditional HIEs, this being more or less what some think of as the brick and mortar HIEs, and then the software developers as well. So thank you for your comment. I think Craig has his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk about a couple of specific words in letter A. So for example, we want healthcare consumers to access to view and download. That makes sense. Control, if we're talking about adding or revoking consent, makes sense. I'm a little bit concerned about the words transmit and submit. I don't think that an HIE is probably the place where a patient would upload medical records. And transmit, they could certainly download data and kind of share it with other people through their own means, but I don't think we envision an HIE creating kind of point-to-point connections for patients to push data.
But isn't, so maybe transmit is used, it has sort of a different context in here. Because if they download it, I feel like, and maybe some of the others can remember, that transmit means they can move that information to a different medium, or without necessarily downloading it, or they could they can use it another way, even if they wanted to send it to another provider. So I maybe, my recollection may be broken on this. I think you're right on submit, although although it could be submit if you think about an HIE that also, say, has a registry like an advanced directive registry. And I believe there's a law now that that will get implemented that perhaps makes CRISP accountable for some level of patients' advanced directives. And so that might be some of the intent behind submit in terms of forward thinking to a registry, if you will. But let's see what others think, because I could be mistaken. But your comment, Craig, is a good one. So let's see. I don't get a good recollection of the order of hands, but I do see, if I take them out of order, my apology. But Dr. Suarez, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, very quickly, and I agree with submit. I think that transmitted, nowadays consumers can mediate the transmission of or create an expectation that a provider or an ATT or a health plan will transmit their data to another entity. They ask the provider or health plan to do it. And so I presume that transmit here would have the same intent. Is for a consumer mediated exchange, where the consumer is taking their data and transmitting it to someone else through the HIE. So that's the way I would understand it. The consumer will have access to view, download, and then transmit through the HIE the data. Submit, I totally agree. So that's one point. The other point is that there is a participating organization in the second sentence that has been added. If a healthcare consumer chooses to utilize an HIE or a participant organization shall do all these things. That is another instance where this regulation is reaching into the participant organization responsibilities. And I think that needs to be also reconsidered.
Fair enough. We'll make a note on that. So, but Dr. Suarez, you say you agree on the submit, but what if the HIE maintains a repository that collects patient information from the consumer, if you will, advanced directives, by way of example?
Well, are there other sections in this regulation? I don't remember, but are there other sections in this regulation that establishes that expectation and responsibility of the HIE to receive data directly from the consumer and incorporate into the records? I think that is a very specific function that, if it's not explicitly stated in the regulation, then it's not clear that the consumer can submit or should submit the data to there. So I think the first question is really, is there any other section? Is there a specific section in the regulation that creates that expectation on the HIE to receive data directly from the consumer?
Yeah, we'll absolutely have to go back through that. There probably needs to be, given the change in some of some legislation that just came out of this current session.
So we have Adrian Ellis hand raised, and then Catherine.
So I just was going to point out that this is a big change from the past regs, right? So this is now a shall require. HIEs shall do these things, as opposed to an HIE who does do these things, who wishes to offer these things, must do it in this way. So when these regs were originally written, the idea was HIEs weren't going to be required to engage directly with patients. They would engage with their participating organizations. And now it appears that the policy is shifting, and we are suggesting that the HIEs will engage with patients in these different ways. And I know the info blocking rule comes into play, and some HIEs like CRISP are going down the path of giving patients access to view and download their information. But I agree with Craig that transmit and submit are concerning, since the beginning of the sentence has changed to an HIE shall do these things. So I would read this as we must allow consumers to transmit and submit their information.
So perhaps we need to make a note to do a little more digging, and maybe there's some wordsmithing, if you will, because if perhaps it needs to be something like, if an HIE makes this available, it shall blank. So it's not saying you have to do it, but if you do, then it has to follow these steps. Would that work?
What I think was how the original regs were written. And my assumption here is that the regs have changed to comply with the information blocking rule, which does seem to require HIEs to provide access to patients to their EHI. The info blocking rule, though, does not require HIEs to allow patients to transmit, to mediate, patient mediated transmission, nor does not require the HIEs to allow patients to submit data. So I'm not suggesting what you want the policy to be, but I just wanted to point out that this is a policy shift from the way the regs were originally drafted.
Yeah, and Kelly, if you could make a note, because it may be if an HIE offers these services, it must blah, blah, blah. Because I feel like there's places in the reg where we say, if you're going to do this, then you have to do it, and that aligns with a certain approach. And we can just check on that.
David, I think the only problem with that is that, to Adrian's point, the HIEs are now going to have to do this. And so the problem is that it's no longer if you do it, because they're going to have to do it. And you're adding additional requirements beyond information blocking. So you've taken their choice out of it and still requiring these extra steps. And I think that's the concern, is like, because they're going to have to do it because information blocking. I think we need to relook at this provision, and Kimberly, the purpose being, you didn't have to engage with the consumer originally. Like, it was, if you wanted to, then this is what you had to do, but not all HIEs offered access to the consumer. So the idea is now all HIEs will have to offer this to the consumer. And I think we should just make sure these align better with the information blocking rule, as opposed to adding additional requirements on the HIEs.
So I think I understand what you're saying, but there's the information blocking elements that we need to make sure that they have to do. But then there's anything additional, it should be, if you're doing it, as opposed to that you must. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Okay.
And Catherine, please.
Yeah, Alana, my memory just triggered. The transmit and submit is historical and now outdated. And it was at the time when personal health records and, API-based consumer pushing of data to phones and stuff was just emerging. And I think this was us attempting to be futuristic, that transmitting and submitting might be something that technologies would enable consumers to do. And I think now it is outdated and does need to be probably struck and or aligned differently based on information blocking.
Yeah, and I think it has to be aligned differently, because there is a bill, Senate Bill 824 and HB 1073, which is the accessibility of electronic advanced care planning documents. And this is going to put some additional requirements, at least on one HIE in the state. And so it does create the transmit and submit element. But to Catherine, your point, it was futuristic then. And I think to what Pamela's saying, it doesn't fit here, but it may be important to keep, particularly if we think about compliance with what will inevitably become a law around advanced care planning and naming a healthcare agent, and consumers being able to change, upload, and download their advanced directives through an HIE, or through an HIE that manages a repository.
All right, that's great. And I'll note, I think that this is going to come up again a little bit further on. I also don't want to ignore, we have a couple of comments in the comment box from Sally Ann, who asks if there's a HIPAA security issue with allowing patients to transmit data sourced from the HIE. And Dr. Suarez says that the first question is whether in the earlier part of the regulation, there's a specific requirement for HIEs to receive or collect data from the consumer directly. And if so, then the submit clause might be appropriate.
Okay. Okay. These are good comments.
Okay, if we're ready to move on a little bit, in A2, we have some revised language that generalizes the Nist requirement. We did get some feedback from policy board members that the original language, specifically requiring Nist level 2, might be more appropriate and that should be kept. So we can pause there to see if there's any discussion. And Adrienne.
I could jump in. So, not being a IT security expert, Nist is, their levels of security. Nist level 2 is pretty restrictive, but Nist level, the lower level, which I always get confused because I think it's 1, is actually very minimal. So there's a huge kind of gap in security between the minimum that Nist might require versus the level 2 requirement. So I do think from an HIE perspective, keeping this broad might not be a problem because most HIEs are probably going to choose a higher level of security anyway. But I did just want to point out that Nist level 1, I think it's LOA, levels of assurance, it's called, is a very low bar to meet for patient identity.
So Adrian, I hear two things. I hear that it makes sense to have the Nist requirement, but I also hear that you're saying that organizations, HIEs, whomever, they tend to elevate the bar as opposed to meeting the floor. Is that fair to say what you're indicating here?
Yes, David. So you're hearing the tension in my dual roles, right? So you're hearing that I work with Chris, who's going to raise the bar likely to make sure that we're not giving access to people that shouldn't have it. But it is likely going to cause, as a patient advocate, that higher level bar is going to keep some patients from being able to easily access their information. So there is tension there between the ability for patients to easily be able to access and making sure that as an HIE, you're not breaching HIPAA by giving someone, David Sharp Jr., David Sharp Sr.'s information, right? So there is some tension there. That is what you're hearing from me.
So balancing of two minds is always a challenge, but I think I hear you. Anybody have any thoughts on this one?
Well, David, Sally, I think the other issue that Adrian has raised is the gap, the delta between LOA and NIST 2. And, we don't have the authority to create a compromise, do we?
Well, it's clunky to try to come up with something.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible. And maybe that is somewhat of a takeaway as well, unless others have some thoughts. I think, Dr. Suarez, you were going to make a note.
So I think the practice overall in the industry is, and there are more and more increased expectations of that, is to at least have a level of assurance 2 in ensuring secure access, authentication, verification, authorization, and access controls when anybody is attempting to access health information. So I don't know why are we deleting the part that says, Nist level 2, and leave it just there instead of this new text that is eliminating the minimum threshold.
Yeah, it can actually work against us if we're too prescriptive. But why don't let's make this as a note, and we'll work with Post and Shell to see if we can come up with some additional language here. That may be the best compromise for the moment, because I think to Adrian's point, there are two very distinct views to have, and that balance is something we probably have to work on a little more.
Well, you could go. I'm sorry to interrupt, but briefly, you could go to ONC's site where they actually have a description of this, and I'm looking for some of the other requirements that push things to level 2. So, if maybe what we should do there is to follow at a minimum the federal requirements or something like that. Make a reference to national requirements rather than creating our own specific one.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, in other places we point, so that could be the balance, if you will. Wow.
All right, so I did want to call out, it is not a proposed change, but we did get a comment here on A5, which, so it says if a healthcare consumer chooses to utilize the electronic access, that there be established an individual unique username and password in accordance with the most recent applicable standards. And there was some feedback that this just may not be necessary if the consumer is using a third-party application.
Yeah, it may be that we need some additional language that carves that out. That's a good point. And Adrian, is this an area where you were going to comment on?
Yeah, so that feedback probably came from us, right? So the third-party applications manage all of that stuff, and the info blocking rule does require us to work with third-party applications, and we have a plan to do so. It also might be a little prescriptive in an area where a patient doesn't necessarily want to establish a username and password and a whole engagement with the HIE. They maybe just want to download their data one time and walk away with it. And so therefore, we should be allowed, I think, to have a process that would enable that as well, and not necessarily have to have a whole user management system for patients who want to access information just one time.
Yeah, and Kelly, can you note that, because that's very important for single one-time users, but because the same challenges exist. How do you know? I think somebody was using David Jr. versus David Sr. So I think we really want to give that one some thought.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Suarez?
Yeah, here you talk about being very, very prescriptive. I mean, the last thing that you would have before getting absolutely complete or prescriptive is to define exactly the parameters for the password, being minimum 16 characters or something like that. So my sense in reality is that several of these items could be simplified by simply establishing the requirement that the HIE will have appropriate levels of security to control authentication, authorization, access, and an audit and all these things, and that they should follow at a minimum the federal requirements applicable to healthcare organizations. I mean, with that, you don't need to say that they need to establish individual unique username and passwords or other things in this particular section. I think I as a healthcare organization, I have not seen yet we have not seen yet any regulations, as in CMS, ONC, and others, that mandate that we establish unique username and passwords. There are regulations that establish, that define appropriate minimum levels of policies, procedures, administrative, physical, and technical for security, and that they follow certain standards. And those standards are the ones that say, well, the minimum level of assurance is this, and the expectations within that LOA. And by the way, it's also IAL, identity assurance levels, and other things. They define this type of thing. So I don't know that there needs to be a specification in this regulation that calls for username and password.
Yeah, understandably. We've got a note here. I think we'll go back. There's always that wrestling with is it the floor or the ceiling, or do we manage somewhere in the middle? I mean, that's kind of been a challenge for a decade or so, if you will. So, but these are very good points. So we'll go back and look, and it could be that we just redirect to, as others said, what exists today, since it's evolving, as opposed to defining it specifically here. That may be a better approach to some of these points that are being raised.
Okay, then traveling down to B, the edits that we have in B really just align with what we discussed in A. So you all can tell me, of course, if there's anything additional here, but here too, again, it is requiring the HIE to provide electronic access. And then let me pause there in case there's anything additional. Okay, hearing none. Then in B1, there is specificity to require the HIE to provide free electronic access to consumers once per month, while then allowing a fee to be charged after that. Any thoughts there? Yes, Dr. Suarez.
Well, just going back, the item before B, there is again participating organization. So, I just want to make sure that there is a notation about the appropriateness of including participating organization here and in the other sections above, because that is creating a series of new requirements for participating organizations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We will go back through this through each section of the regulation, because we have talked about that a few times in prior meetings, and so we're working from a static version. But yeah, as we continue to evolve in the next version, we will attempt to rectify these kinds of scenarios.
And then a follow-up comment, which is on number 1 there. I'm not sure why there would be a restriction to only allow once per month at no cost. I mean, we as providers and payers cannot do that type of a restriction. If they want to access their health information every 5 minutes, they can still do it. And we don't charge. And
yeah, this is actually the concept of this goes back to the early days of the brick and mortar. So yeah, we should make a note to revisit this, because I understand what you're saying, but there was a time when it was necessary, because the concerns of the HIEs were that how do you manage this in the scenario, Dr. Suarez, you just noted. Again, times have changed, and now technologies certainly far outpace this requirement.
David, this is Rob Horst. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Good afternoon, Rob.
Yeah. I mean, not all HIEs provide consumer access capabilities at all. Like for example, none of the services we provide would ever allow a consumer to download anything. And so I feel like there just needs to be, like, if applicable type of language
Yeah, and Rob, that's something Lee brought up earlier on, and I think it's an excellent point because we have to make sure that given that the variation in HIEs, if you will, and I mentioned the difference between the traditional HIEs and the software developers. And I think you're saying there's still a blend of even the traditional HIEs that might be doing ADT, sending ADTs as their core mission.
And Adrian, I see your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to agree with Dr. Suarez. I'm not sure. I'm assuming Post and Shell looked that the IFR allows for charging for electronic access. It may in the fees exception, but it's real tricky, I think, to figure out how you're going to charge those. And I would just point out that doing the work on this, the cost is actually the very first time, right? When you validate, the cost actually comes validating the patient's identity is usually what's going to be the most costly for an HIE to provide access. And so I don't see that there's going to be a lot of additional cost if they come back, additional times because the identity validation is the costly piece. So
Yeah, and
I'm not sure here whether it's necessary to be able to charge if they come back next month and then the month after.
yeah, Adrian, we'll go back because I'm pretty sure it doesn't include a fee. But this may be an attempt to hold on to the spirit of what existed before and just move it around. So, but we'll go back and take a look at that. That's a good point.
Okay, then again in C, then we have aligned language here with the changes that we saw in A and B. So requiring the access to electronic health information and then the inclusion of participating organizations. So we will carry comments forward there unless anyone says otherwise or has anything to add here. Okay. Hearing nothing, then I will repeat myself for D. We have mirrored changes there in section D. Okay, let me pause. Pamela, go ahead.
So Alana, I think there was a comment on one of those provisions and I agree with it. So I just wanted to point it out, which was under 1, that the obligation to provide patients health information that is equivalent to what is made available to authorized users that are healthcare providers. The comment in the column is very important, which is, even under information blocking and HIPAA and state law, there are certain things that you can withhold from patients if it causes a risk to life or physical injury of another person. So we just want to make sure that exception would follow through, that the HIE can also block that information.
Very good point. That is so true.
Yes, thanks for calling that out. And it's, yep, all right. So then we can move down a bit to D, Kelly. Okay.
Alana, sorry, Alana, can you actually go up to 2? Because I think some of this information, this might be another place where we need to take a look at what is actually allowable. And the same comment that Pamela just made above may also apply here at 2. So at a minimum, it appears that it appears here, if I read this quickly, that it's requiring certain information be made at a minimum. Some of this information may not necessarily, some of this information, not to get too into the weeds, may come to the HIE through not participating or healthcare providers, could come through contractual requirements with the health department and therefore not subject to info blocking and may not yet be allowed to share that information. So I would just ask that we be thoughtful here about requiring information that the HIE may not be contractually allowed to share. Specifically immunizations is what I'm looking at. And then again, that Pamela's comment still applies, the comment that Pamela just referenced still applies in this section as well.
Yeah, I think it's mostly through C. I think that it applies. So we want to make sure we want to make sure that's the case or it isn't the case. It seems like it would apply throughout.
Okay. Kimberly.
Yeah, Adrian, you said something about immunization records not being shared with the patient who received the immunization. What did I miss? That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so there's certain data that comes to the HIE through not through healthcare providers, but through our partnerships with public health authorities, and patients have another way to get that information. Like Immunet, for example, provides patients access to their immunization data, and so Maryland Department of Health controls its immunization data, and it tells the HIE how it can use the immunization data. And if it's not in our contract that we can share it with patients, then we can't share it with patients. We're working on this, but I just want to make sure that there are some things here where prescription drug monitoring program data is another example where there is a process by which patients can request that data. So even though it's made available through the HIE is not making it available to patients. There's very limited data, but there are some things, and one of them is listed here, unfortunately.
Interesting and troubling.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for those comments. Okay, we have then some changes to D. So again, and I feel like I'm missing, did I skip one? Is that, so the addition of resources available through the HIE or other entity to help assist the healthcare consumer to resolve technical issues. So this is an addition to include a requirement for an HIE, and it says participating organization, but again, we'll carry that through and consider that, the appropriateness of that. But to provide consumers with information about available resources for technical issues that may prevent electronic access to their health information. Any thoughts there? No issues. Okay. Then in D, again, we have the requirement to provide electronic access to consumers and the inclusion of participating organizations. And then this also specifies consumer control as it is used in C4 and D2 above, specifying the ability to view and print health information. So I will pause there for any thoughts on the changes to that language.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the participating organization piece. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sure. Dr. Squares, we're not able to hear you if you're speaking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't hear my name there. All right. Yes. So, no, I just wanted to make a comment here on when you look at D1, this is exactly the type of language that can be used up above where there was language about you have to set up username and passwords and all that. See how here the expectation is to implement technologies. And of course, one can say implement administrative, physical, and technical security procedures and policies that meet industry standards and have practices. So that is the kind of language that creates the expectation of a industry level best practice and an expectation that the entity will establish their policies, whether they choose to use biometrics or for identity management, or they use username and password or something else. So that is just one suggestion I had, because I think this is the language that I was looking for to try to simplify and eliminate all these micromanagement level of regulations that exist in the other sections.
Yeah, good point. And Kelly, if you afterwards can just highlight this in yellow, that would be good as well. We can spot it better. Okay.
Okay. Craig.
Yeah, and this is maybe a half-formed thought, but the word control seems to be doing a lot of work in that sentence. And so if we're talking about the ability to opt out, like that's one form of control, and that's very different from, you know, a much richer form of control that I don't think we're trying to envision here.
I have the same thought as Craig. I'm not sure I understand what control means. It almost seems like they can control what it says, and I mean, I don't know what it. I'm with Craig. I'm not sure it has a lot of meaning.
Kimberly, it's a defined term.
Yeah, it is one of these ones that's defined at the front end. I just went back to look. So it is the ability for the consumer to electronically provide instructions to an HIE regarding the disclosure of the patient's information, which could include the individuals and organizations to whom the HIE may disclose, the circumstances, all emergency only or inpatient under which the patient's health information may be disclosed, type of information that may be disclosed, right? The more granular control stuff. So it is sort of a opt-out plus.
Yeah, and I think we want to come back to a control, and maybe we just make a side note, Alana, when we get going back through this again with post and shell, because right now there isn't a level of granularity in the HIE world that at that depth. You're either in or you're all out. And I think if we want to be futuristic, where this may be something that occurs in the next year or so, we have to find a better way to say this without today making it where granularity in terms of opting in or opting out and who you wish to share information with doesn't become a burden. Because particularly back to the software developers, it's just either you're in or you're out. There's not an easy way to meter it. But so we want to come back to that definition. And I think Kim.
Yeah, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought legislation passed last year requires some of that granularity.
It requires opt-in or opt-out. And that CRISP is one of the HIEs. And there are some on the call here today that are working in testing with or advancing to testing with the CRISP on the consumer consent management utility.
So you're saying the legislation that was passed last year doesn't require?
The legislation is opt-in or opt-out.
Right. Well, I know. Okay.
But it's not going to say, it's not the utility, the way it's being developed today, based upon the technology, is it's all in or all out. There isn't a way to say, well, I want this to go to this provider, this to go to that provider, this to this individual. In time, there will be. But the first stage is, let's just make sure that consumers have that broad capability. Consumers can opt out anyway, but even before this utility was put forth in legislation, they just have to go to each individual HIE. But I don't minimize that because most consumers don't know all the HIEs. It's an onerous task, both for opting out and opting in. This utility, the legislation will make it a centralized source for consumers to control access to the information for HIEs that operate in Maryland.
Gotcha.
Just as a small maybe aside, as we all think about operationalizing the info blocking rule, creating more granular control also of data that's going to flow in all sorts of different creative ways is going to be very technically challenging.
Yeah, and it's not something that will happen on day one.
Okay. Moving on, I will again repeat myself with E. The changes here align with changes above requiring the electronic access and inclusion of the participating organization. So we'll carry comments forward there as well. And if we look a little bit further down, we have some additional change in wording where we will have to carry forward comments here as, again, where we've included participating organization instead of using third party throughout F and G. And then if we scroll down a little bit further, we can move to H, where there is some added language in H1 that requires HIEs to make information available in the format requested by the consumer. Yes, Pamela.
I just don't love the word any. That just seems a little too broad. I think it should mirror, and I can't remember exactly the word that information blocking uses, but I think it's the form and format, requested by the consumer, if feasible, or something like that. It seems
Yeah,
like
there's
more
guardrails. Yeah, there's guardrails. Yeah, in any form requested. Yeah, I hear you. That's true. Good catch.
Okay. Adrian.
Yeah, I was just going to agree and reserve the right to view seems like a bit too much. There's the content and manner description, and there's the idea that we will consider requests, one at a time. If they don't like the options we're going to provide, they can ask for another option. But I do think we don't want to be setting an expectation that the HIE is going to be able to print paper copies and mail them to your office, right? So I think we want to provide some guardrails here if possible.
And we also need to highlight the second to the last line here, because whatever change we make to view, download, submit, and control, we need to carry through here.
Craig.
I might just make a minor comment on paper access. Like, I'm not sure, but I bet we have many patients with thousands and thousands of pages of documents. Like, knowing what we know now about CCDAs and kind of the junk that they contain, paper might not be feasible, at least only in extreme circumstances.
Why don't we
I'm
make?
sorry. I would just point out, sorry, David, I would just point out that I don't think the info blocking rule specifically requires paper. It requires you to provide electronic access to information and then to consider patients' requests. So maybe we can just align the language.
Yeah, I was just
with
going to
IBR.
say. I was just going to say that. So, yeah, that was mine.
Okay. Then in H2, we have struck the language if available. So this kind of removes the exception in the circumstance that electronic access is not available per that requirement change made throughout. Okay. And hearing no comments there, we have an addition of 3. So this includes a requirement to make health information available in paper format if requested by the consumer. So I think getting at some of your comments there, Craig, as well. We'll pause for any more.
Yeah, and this is also including the submit
Yeah.
issue, so it needs to be.
We have to look at that because, yeah, that it's consistent with the other areas above.
And there was, before this, there was another submit that I caught in the screen, so I presume there will be a need to search for the word submit across the board.
Agreed. And Kelly, you just want to make a note of that for scanning. Catherine.
Yeah, this also has the HIE and its third-party language that we've already altered above. So for consistency, should do the same thing here.
Good point.
All right. If that rounds out the comments there, then we can give ourselves a big pat on the back because we've made it all the way through.
So that's great. So, Alana, we'll be giving back the group 45 minutes today. And do we want to talk a little bit about next steps and timing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just to reiterate what David said earlier, we'll be working with Post and Shell over the next few weeks to revisit, digest the comments that everyone involved in this HIE policy board has provided us over the previous months. We will work with the AAG here at MHCC to then go through and look at the changes, the proposed changes that are made that have come out of the changes that Post and Shell recommended, as well as the comments and feedback from this group. And then we will move forward to the informal public comment period from there. So David, please let me know if I've missed anything. I think that about sums up the next steps. So if there's anything additional or anything that you or Ben would like to add in closing, please go ahead.
So before we invite Ben and say a few words, just to note that we're looking for our Alexa to really examine it for legal sufficiency and make sure that what we've proposed as policy that will become regulations doesn't butt up against or does not conform to what may exist or what ought to exist. We sort of outlined a process, but it's an evolutionary one. So if we get through this next round and we think that we need to convene this group again, the policy board, before we move further to informal public comments, then we may do that. But we're trying to move these through because there is another set of changes that for legislation that was passed in this session, and of course even from last session, that wasn't really defined in the scope of work that we engaged Post and Shell to help us with. So we need to try to get everything pulled together so we can propose a complete set of regulations that include everything that went through the legislature up through this current year session 2022. And we'd like to try to get this for at least informal public comment sometime in the late summer, early fall. And we think we can do this at the pace that we're on. So we may need to come back and look at sections of it with you all, but as individuals, as organizations, there are at least 2 more opportunities for you to comment. And if there's something that you think we've missed, we'll circulate the draft back anyway, and you can note it again in the draft. So there's lots of opportunities. It's just we're not necessarily certain that we require to convene formally like this to work through it, at least in this next round or 2. So with that, as always, I'm so impressed with the talent and commitment that you all have put forth year over year, actually. And we really are appreciative of that. We couldn't do this without you. And so we tip our hats to the great work that you all do and have done in the past. So I'll pause here and invite our executive director into comment.
David, I couldn't have said it better. It's most impressive to listen to the comments and the care at which people have gone through these regs. I just want to echo what David said a minute ago, that we in a sense are a year and a half behind in terms of aligning these regulations with what will soon be current law, or we believe will be current statute. And we kind of are calling a brief timeout to look at whether we go forward with these through the regulatory process or pause and make some additional changes to reflect changes in the statute from last year or this year. But we'll keep you all informed going forward. Keep in mind that the formal promulgation process is a fairly complex endeavor. Not only do we have stakeholders that are with us at every step of the way, but we also have all the elected leadership all the way up to the governor that weigh in on this, and showing up repeatedly for updates of the same regulations. Comartin 2518 is going to be require clarifications to them. So we want to think carefully about what makes the most sense as we move forward. But all of this work is really demonstrates to me how much commitment the entire policy board has to this endeavor. So I want to thank you very much for your commitment to our common endeavor.
Okay, Alana, do you want to close us out?
I think that's it. Thank you all. Thank you, Ben and David, for your leadership, and thanks everyone on the call for your contributions. We will be in touch.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a nice afternoon.
Bye.